The executioner's axe gleamed under the cold torchlight, ready to fall on the last of the half-bloods. But as the Alpha King raised his hand to give the signal, a jolt of searing energy ripped through him, his wolf howling a single impossible word in his mind, *mate*. He stared at the woman kneeling before him, not with hatred, but with a terrifying world, shattering recognition. His sworn enemy was his one true destiny. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The grimy alleyways of Silverwood were a maze of perpetual twilight, a place where the sun struggled to pierce the thick canopy of soot and smoke belching from the town's countless chimneys. Rain-soaked cobblestones glistened with a permanent sheen of filth, and the air was a thick cocktail of wet wool, wood smoke, and despair. This was the world Selina Graves inhabited, a world she navigated with her head bowed and her senses on a razor's edge. Blend in, stay invisible. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. The mantra was a constant, silent hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, a survival instinct honed over 24 years of hiding. She ran a small stall in the market, a humble herbalist and trader dealing in poultices for coughs and dried herbs for cooking pots. It was an anonymous, unassuming life, perfectly crafted to conceal the truth of her blood. Her senses, however, were a constant source of anxiety, a betrayal waiting to happen. The scent of a rotting apple core 50 paces away was a nauseating punch. The frantic heartbeat of a cornered rat, a distracting drum against her ears. They were gifts from a lineage she had to deny, a whisper of the wolf blood that mingled with her human heritage, making her an abomination in the eyes of the Alpha King and his purist regime. One dreary afternoon, the rhythm of her carefully constructed life shattered. A drayman's cart, its axle broken and its load of ale barrels shifting dangerously, careened down the narrow street. People screamed and scattered, a chaotic wave of panic. Selina was directly in its path, her mind calculating the trajectory, the speed, the splintering wood, and the crushing weight. There was no time for human reflexes. There was only instinct. In a movement too fluid, too fast for the eye to properly track, she sidestepped, not with a clumsy leap, but with a blur of grace that seemed to defy the very air she moved through. She was safe, pressed back against the cold, damp brick of a tannery, her heart hammering not from fear of the crash, but from the terror of being seen. The cart smashed into a butcher's stall with a deafening roar of splintering wood and shattering glass, the street flooding with the sharp, yeasty scent of spilled ale. No one was looking at her. They were all focused on the disaster. All except one. From across the square, leaning against the stone archway of the barracks, Captain Marcus of the Royal Guard watched her. His eyes, sharp and discerning, narrowed. He hadn't seen exactly what happened, but he had seen the result. A woman who should have been crushed was standing untouched, without even a speck of mud on her cloak. He didn't know what she was, but he knew what she wasn't. She wasn't normal, and in the kingdom of Alpha King Lucien Vale, the abnormal were a threat to be investigated and, if necessary, purged. 2 days later, Captain Marcus appeared at her stall. He was a tall man, built like an oak tree, his face a landscape of grim duty. He didn't browse her wares with the idle curiosity of a typical customer. His gaze was direct, unsettling. He spoke of needing rare herbs for the castle's master of potions, herbs she was known to stock, nightshade and silverleaf. He named a generous price, enough to feed her for a month, and asked her to bring a sample to a courtyard near the west gate, away from the market's prying eyes. Every instinct screamed at her. It was a trap. The scent of deceit was sharp and acrid on him, more potent than the dried lavender hanging from her stall's awning. But to refuse was to confirm his suspicion. To run was to be hunted. Caught between two terrible choices, she chose the one that offered a sliver of a chance, however slim. She agreed. She met him in the designated courtyard, a quiet, stone-flagged space enclosed by the high, windowless walls of old storehouses. The air was still, the usual city noise muffled and distant. She held out the small, cloth-wrapped bundle of herbs. "As requested, Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Marcus didn't take it. His eyes flickered to the rooftops above. "Whatever you think you saw," Selina said, her voice low and urgent, "you're mistaken. I'm just a herbalist. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cold professionalism. "The king will be the judge of that," he said, and it was the only signal needed. From the shadows of the alleyways and the rooftops above, a dozen royal guards emerged, their armor glinting dully in the gray light. They moved with silent, predatory efficiency, their swords drawn. Selina didn't hesitate. She dropped the herbs and exploded into motion, a desperate, cornered animal. She was a whirlwind of surprising agility, ducking under a sword swing, using the wall as a springboard to kick another guard back. Her strength, another forbidden secret, allowed her to break the arm of a man who tried to grab her. But they were prepared. They hadn't come for a simple herbalist. They had come for something more. Heavy nets, woven with the unmistakable burning threads of silver, were thrown. The moment the metal touched her skin, it was like being set on fire. A searing, agonizing pain ripped through her, sapping her strength, smothering her senses. She collapsed to the cobblestones, tangled and helpless, the world dissolving into a vortex of agony as they closed in. The throne room of Alpha King Lucien Vale was a monument to conquest and intimidation. It was an immense, cavernous hall, its vaulted ceilings lost in shadow, its cold stone walls adorned with the tattered banners of defeated clans and the mounted weapons of fallen enemies. The air was still and frigid, smelling of polished granite, old steel, and the faint, electric scent of ozone that always seemed to cling to places of great power. Selina was dragged in, her body still aching from the silver's touch, the heavy iron chains on her wrists and ankles a brutal weight. She was forced to her knees before the throne, a massive, unadorned seat of black iron, and on it sat the Alpha King. Lucien Vale was as formidable as his reputation suggested. He was not a man who sat on a throne. He was a man who commanded it, his presence filling the vast space. His face was a mask of hard, unyielding authority, his silver eyes carrying the profound weight of a past tragedy that had carved him from a prince into a ruthless king. He looked down at her, his gaze distant and cold, as if she were not a person but merely a piece of unpleasant business to be concluded. He saw the pointed tips of her ears, the subtle, almost imperceptible glow to her skin, the signs of her mixed blood. He saw a half-blood, a remnant of the kind he had sworn an oath to eradicate. The law is the law. Lucien's voice echoed in the chilling silence, each word a hammer blow of finality. He spoke not to her, but to the assembled court, a gallery of stern, watching faces. The half-blood taint ends here. There will be no exceptions. He looked past her, toward the hulking, hooded figure of the royal executioner who stood waiting by a massive chopping block. Selina lifted her head, her fear giving way to a grim, defiant acceptance. She met the king's gaze, her own eyes, a startling shade of violet holding his without submission. "Get on with it, then," she spat, her voice raw but unbroken. "Your kind has been hunting mine for generations. Finish the job." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, crossed the king's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He had seen defiance before. It changed nothing. He raised a single, gauntleted hand, the signal for the executioner to proceed. The axe was lifted high. The court held its collective breath, but as his hand began to fall, it happened. A jolt, violent and absolute, ripped through him. It was not a physical blow, but something deeper, a cataclysm of the soul. A blinding golden light that only he and the prisoner could see flashed between them, and a searing energy surged through his veins, a primal force that slammed into his very core. His inner wolf, a beast of controlled fury he had mastered for decades, rose up with a disbelieving, possessive roar that shattered the iron walls of his control. Mine! Asterisk. The word was not a thought, it was a brand on his soul. The shock was so profound, so physically and mentally staggering, that his hand froze in midair. His gaze snapped back to the woman kneeling before him, but this time he wasn't seeing a half-blood. He was seeing the other half of his own soul. His breath hitched. The world tilted on its axis. The executioner waited, the axe poised. The court stared in confused silence. And Alpha King Lucien Vale, the man who had sworn to kill her kind, could do nothing but stare at the impossible truth kneeling in chains at his feet. His fated mate, The chaos in the throne room was a tidal wave of noise and confusion. Courtiers murmured, their whispers rising to a panicked buzz. The executioner stood frozen, his massive axe held aloft, a grotesque statue of interrupted violence. Lord Valerius, a stern, hawkish man whose family had been decimated in a blood raid decades prior, was already on his feet, his face a thunderous mask of outrage. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice a low growl of disbelief. "What is the meaning of this hesitation?" Lucien didn't hear him. The world had narrowed to the frantic, terrified beat of Selina's heart, a rhythm that echoed his own. The bond, this impossible, undeniable connection, was a roaring fire in his veins, demanding he protect, possess, and claim the woman he had been seconds away from murdering. His wolf clawed at the inside of his mind, a frantic primal beast that had found its other half. He shoved the feeling down, burying it under layers of ice and iron discipline he had cultivated his entire life. He lowered his hand, not with the slow grace of a king, but with the stiff, jerky motion of a man fighting a war within himself. "Take her away," he commanded, his voice rough, unfamiliar even to his own ears. The guards hesitated, their eyes darting from the king to the prisoner to the executioner. "Not to the dungeons," Lucien snapped, his authority returning like a whip crack. "Take her to the West Wing, the Queen's suite. Post the royal guard at the door. No one enters, no one leaves, without my direct command." The order was so bizarre, so contrary to every law and precedent, that it stunned the court into silence. The Queen's suite, vacant and sealed since his mother's death, was hallowed ground. To place a condemned blood there was not just mercy, it was sacrilege. Captain Marcus, his face a stony mask of confusion, was the first to react. He nodded sharply, gesturing to his men. They moved with renewed purpose, hauling a stunned Selina to her feet. As they led her away, her violet eyes met Lucien's across the vast hall, a silent, searing question hanging in the air between them. He offered no answer, turning his back on her to face the storm he had just unleashed. He found it in the council chamber, a room that felt more like a cage of vultures. The 10 lords of his inner circle were assembled, their faces ranging from grim confusion to outright fury. Lord Valerius stood before the hearth, his shadow dancing like a demon in the firelight. "You have lost your senses, Lucien," Valerius spat, dispensing with all formality. To halt the execution was a sign of weakness. To house that thing times in the royal suite is an act of madness. It is an abomination, a trick sent by our enemies to poison you, to poison this kingdom. His voice resonated with the absolute conviction of a fanatic, his hatred for bloods a palpable force in the room. It was a hatred Lucien himself had legitimized and weaponized for years. "My family's blood cries out from the ground, slaughtered by her kind," Valerius continued, his hand clenching into a white-knuckled fist. "And you would give her a bed of silk? She should be in chains, awaiting the fire." Another lord, a portly man named Gregor, wrung his hands. "The prophecy, Valerius. The old texts speak of a fated mate." "Fables!" Valerius roared, silencing him. "Fairy tales to frighten children. We deal in reality, in the blood and steel that holds this kingdom together. The king's judgment is clouded. That creature in the West Wing is a cancer. It must be cut out before it infects us all. I demand her immediate death." Lucien listened, his face impassive, his silver eyes cold as a winter sky. He let the arguments wash over him, feeling the weight of their prejudice, a prejudice he had once shared with equal fervor. But now, the bond thrummed within him, a constant, undeniable truth that made their hatred feel like the screeching of fools. "She is my prisoner now, Valerius," Lucien said, his voice low and dangerous, cutting through the noise. "My decision. The execution is postponed." He could not, explain the bond to them. They would see it as the very witchcraft Valerius claimed it to be. "She may hold intelligence we require. Until I have questioned her thoroughly, she remains under my protection." It was a weak excuse, and he knew it, but it was the only one he had. He turned and left the chamber, the furious, sputtering outrage of Lord Valerius following him like a foul stench. The Queen's suite was a world away from the grime of silverwood and the cold terror of the throne room. The air smelled of dried roses and beeswax. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, casting a warm, dancing glow over furniture draped in dust cloths. It was a place of suffocating luxury, the silk sheets on the canopied bed and the gilded mirrors feeling like a cruel mockery of her freedom. Selina stood in the center of the room, her chains finally removed, her body trembling with a mixture of residual pain from the silver and profound, disorienting shock. She was alive. She should be dead, her head separated from her body, but she was alive and standing in a room fit for royalty. It made no sense. The king, the butcher of her people, had saved her. Why? The heavy oak door opened, and he was there, filling the doorway, his presence sucking the very air from the room. The mate bond, a low, humming current before, flared into a roaring inferno in his proximity. It was a physical pull, a magnetic force drawing her toward him, even as every rational part of her mind screamed to run. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing like a death knell. He stalked toward her, his silver eyes burning with a conflicted fire. His wolf was a restless, pacing predator in his mind, urging him, claim her. She is ours. Mark her, make her safe. He fought it, his hands clenched at his sides. Who are you? He demanded, his voice a harsh growl. What magic is this? What trick are you playing? Selina flinched but held her ground, lifting her chin in a familiar show of defiance. No magic, no tricks. Her voice was steadier than she felt. I am Selina Graves, a herbalist from Silverwood. That is all. Lies, he snarled, circling her like a wolf stalking its prey. The air crackled with tension, with the raw, magnetic pull of their bond. I saw your speed in the courtyard. I felt this. He gestured vaguely between them, unable to name the cataclysmic force that had upended his world. You are a half-blood, a creature of deceit. And you are a king of murderers, she shot back, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of anger. Do you mock all your prisoners with such finery before you kill them? Is this part of the ritual? His eyes flashed, and for a second, she thought he might strike her. Instead, he stopped, his face a mask of torment. The man and the wolf were at war within him, his duty and his hatred clashing with an instinct so powerful it threatened to consume him. He saw the terror that lay just beneath her defiance, the way her pulse hammered in the delicate skin of her throat. The urge to soothe that fear, to pull her against him and surround her with his scent, was so overwhelming it made him physically ache. You will remain here, he said, his back to her. You will speak to no one. You will attempt to escape at your own peril. When I have answers, I will decide your fate. He left as quickly as he had come, slamming the door behind him, leaving Selina alone with the ghost of his scent and the bewildering, terrifying hope that had begun to bloom in her chest. Later, a servant brought a tray laden with roasted meats, spiced wine, and delicate pastries. The aroma was intoxicating, but Selina stared at it with deep suspicion. Kindness from her sworn enemy was more frightening than his wrath. She imagined the food laced with a slow-acting poison, a more subtle execution than the axe. She refused to touch it, her stomach churning with a mixture of hunger and fear. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and the grand, lonely room grew cold. She sat huddled in a chair, wrapped in a dusty sheet she'd pulled from a sofa, her resolve hardening with every passing minute. She would not die from a coward's poison. The door opened again. It was Lucien. He carried no weapons, and his royal tunic had been replaced with a simple black shirt. In his hands he held a small, plain wooden tray. On it was a hunk of dark bread, a wedge of sharp white cheese, and a simple clay cup of water. He said nothing, merely walked to a small table, set the tray down, and pushed it toward her. The gesture was so unexpected, so mundane, that it shattered her composure more effectively than any threat could have. He had brought it himself. There was no servant, no taster. He had fetched it from the kitchens, a king serving his prisoner. Eat, he said, his voice low and gruff, a poor attempt to mask the concern that had driven the action. A dead captive is of no use to me. Selina stared at the simple meal, then up at him. She saw the conflict still raging in his eyes, the battle between the king and the man, the hater and the mate. But she also saw something else, a flicker of vulnerability, the first crack in his hardened iron exterior. Slowly, her hand shaking, she reached out and took the bread. It was still warm. She took a small bite, the simple, honest taste of it filling her mouth. It was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. They stayed like that for a long moment, the king watching his captive eat a meal he had brought her, a fragile, unspoken truce forming in the silent, firelit room. The truce was shattered in the dead of night. Selina was jolted from a light, uneasy sleep not by a sound, but by a sudden, chilling drop in the room's temperature. The fire had been reduced to glowing embers, but this was a different kind of cold, a cold that carried the scent of malice and death. Her eyes snapped open. A shadow detached itself from the heavy drapery near the wall. A figure clad in black, a long, thin blade gleaming in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. An assassin. Her heart leaped into her throat, a scream dying before it could form. She scrambled backward on the bed, her mind racing. There was nowhere to run. The doors were guarded, the windows a sheer drop to the stone courtyard below. The assassin moved with a silent, fluid grace, his eyes fixed on her with cold, murderous intent. He raised his blade, the tip aimed at her heart. This was it, then. The king's mercy had just been a prelude to a more private execution. But just as the assassin lunged, the main chamber door burst open with the force of a battering ram, splintering from its hinges. Lucien stood there, not as a king, but as a primal force of nature. His silver eyes were glowing with a terrifying feral light, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. He hadn't been summoned by a guard. He hadn't heard a sound. He had been drawn by a primal, instinctual scream from the mate bond, a visceral feeling of his other half being in mortal danger. He crossed the room in 2 bounds, a blur of controlled fury. The assassin, a professional loyal to Lord Valerius, was caught completely by surprise. He tried to turn his blade on the king, but he was impossibly outmatched. Lucien's hand shot out, catching the man's wrist in a grip of iron. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the blade clattered to the floor. Before the man could even cry out, Lucien's other hand was around his throat, lifting him effortlessly from the ground. There was a brief, brutal struggle, and then a final, sharp snap. The assassin went limp. Lucien dropped the body to the floor, as if it were a piece of trash. He stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, the feral glow slowly fading from his eyes as he turned to look at Selina. She was pressed against the headboard, her eyes wide with terror, staring not at the dead man on the floor, but at him. He had just saved her life. The reality of the danger she was in, and the raw, undeniable violence of his own protective reaction, crashed down on him. His duty, his hatred, his laws, they were all just dust in the wind compared to this. His decision was no longer a choice. It was an imperative. He had to protect her, even from himself, even from his own kingdom. The silence that followed the assassin's death was heavier than any sound. Lucien stood over the body, his knuckles white, the primal rage of the wolf slowly receding, leaving the cold, sharp mind of the king in its wake. He had killed to protect her. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. It was an act that severed him from the man he had been, from the laws he had written in blood and grief. He looked at Selina, huddled on the bed, her violet eyes wide with a fear that was now directed entirely at him, her savior, her captor, her fated mate. He knew then that instinct and duty were no longer separate paths. They had converged, and they led directly to her. He needed answers, not from her, but from the history that had long been forgotten, from the whispers of prophecy that men like Valerius dismissed as fables. He left her with 2 of his most trusted royal guard posted inside the room itself, their orders absolute, protect her with their lives. Then he strode through the cold, sleeping castle, his boots echoing in the stone corridors, his destination, the ancient heart of the fortress, the royal archives. He summoned Alara, the keeper of lore, a woman so old she seemed woven from the dust and parchment that surrounded her. She arrived in a whisper of gray robes, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes holding a calm, knowing light that had seen kings rise and fall. The archives smelled of dry paper, leather, and the slow, patient decay of centuries. Scrolls were stacked to the high, vaulted ceilings, and massive, leather-bound tomes lay chained to reading stands. Your Majesty. Alara's voice was like the rustle of dry leaves. You seek something in the dead of night. This is never a good omen. Lucien dispensed with pleasantries. His turmoil was too great. There are prophecies, Alara, old ones, about the bond between mates. He couldn't bring himself to say more, to confess that his fated mate was the very creature he had sworn to destroy. Alara showed no surprise. She simply nodded, her gaze drifting toward a dark, dusty corner of the archives. The bond is the soul of our people, Lucien. It is not a thing of prophecy, but of life itself. But you are not asking about a normal bond, are you? She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her fingers trailing over the spines of ancient scrolls. You are asking about an impossible one. She stopped before a heavy, iron-bound chest, producing a small, ornate key from a chain around her neck. With a click, she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, slender scroll, its casing made of blackened silver. This has not been read in 500 years, she said, carefully unrolling the brittle parchment. The script was archaic, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. She began to read, her voice filling the silent, dusty air. When the sun bleeds and the moon weeps, the last child of two bloods shall be bound to the wolf of the Vale. Lucien's breath caught in his chest. The last child of two bloods. Selina, Alara continued, her voice steady. Not as a curse, but as a key. Together they will forge a new dawn or usher in the final night. She finished reading and looked up at him, her ancient eyes seeming to pierce the very depths of his soul. It does not say she is the curse, my king, she said softly. It says she is the key. The lock is the future of our people. A key, not an abomination, not a trick. A key. The word echoed in the hollow spaces of his confusion, offering not a solution, but a purpose. He had been looking at her as the end of his crusade, when the prophecy claimed she was the beginning of something far greater. He returned to the Queen's suite as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and rose. The body of the assassin was gone, the room cleaned, but the memory of the attack lingered, a phantom chill in the air. Selina was awake, sitting in the same chair, her posture rigid, her eyes tracking his every move with a wary, untrusting gaze. He dismissed the guards and ordered a meal to be brought for them both. Not a tray of leftovers, but a proper breakfast from the royal kitchens. They ate in a tense, charged silence, the only sounds the clinking of silverware and the crackle of the newly lit fire. The food was rich, the coffee hot and strong, but it all tasted like ash in Lucien's mouth. He had to break the silence, to cross the chasm of fear and hatred that separated them. Tell me about your life, he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He was no longer interrogating a prisoner. He was trying to understand the woman who held his destiny in her hands. Selina looked up, surprised. She had expected more questions about magic, about half-blood conspiracies. She hesitated, then began to speak, her voice low and cautious at first. She told him of a life spent in the shadows, of moving from one squalid town to the next, of her mother, a human healer, who had died when she was young, and of a father she never knew, a werewolf who had been hunted down and killed by royal decree before she was born. She spoke of the constant fear, the gnawing loneliness, the ache of never belonging anywhere. As she spoke, the image of the defiant prisoner, the snarling half-blood, began to dissolve, replaced by the portrait of a young woman who had endured a lifetime of loss and persecution. Her vulnerability was a key in a lock he hadn't known was rusted shut. He found himself speaking of his own past, of a time before the crown had settled on his head like a block of ice. I had a brother, he said, his voice rough with a grief that was still raw after all these years. His name was Alistair. He was younger than me, full of light and laughter. He stared into the fire, seeing not flames but the ghosts of memory. There was a border raid, a group of half-blood mercenaries. They were pillaging, burning. Alistair was just a boy. He wasn't a threat. But one of them, he killed him. Lucien's hand clenched on the arm of his chair, the leather groaning in protest. The half-blood who killed him. He was laughing. I saw him. I heard him. I swore that day I would eradicate their kind from this world. I would silence that laughter forever. He finally looked at her, his silver eyes swimming with a pain that mirrored her own. My hatred, it was born from that loss. It has been the foundation of my entire reign. In the quiet of the room, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts, a fragile bridge of understanding began to form, built not on the fire of their bond, but on the shared ashes of their pain. The next morning, Lucien took her to a private training ground, a high, walled courtyard of packed earth and weapon racks. The rising sun cast long shadows, and the air was crisp and cool. "The prophecy calls you a key," he said, his voice all business, a mask for the turmoil her proximity caused. "And Elara said you have abilities. I need to understand them." He tossed her a blunted practice sword. "Show me." She caught it with a natural grace. The session began as an interrogation, a test, but it quickly became something more. She was fast, impossibly so, but it was more than speed. It was anticipation. She moved not just in reaction to him, but in concert with him, her senses telling her what he would do a fraction of a second before he did it. He was a master swordsman, trained since birth, but she met his every move. The clang of steel on steel became a frantic rhythm, a percussive dance. The physical exertion, the sweat, the labored breaths, all served to heighten the electric pull of the mate bond until the air between them was thick and heavy, crackling with an energy that had nothing to do with combat. He lunged, and she sidestepped, using his momentum to spin inside his guard, the flat of her blade resting against his throat before he could even register her movement. They stood frozen, breathless, chests heaving. They were so close he could see the flecks of gold in her violet eyes, smell the scent of herbs and wild things on her skin. The line between a duel and an embrace had vanished completely. "You're fast, Your Majesty," she said, her voice a low, breathless murmur. "But you rely only on what you see. I can feel the shift in the air, hear the whisper of your muscles before you move." She pulled back, and the spell was broken, but the echo of it remained, a silent acknowledgement of the power that flowed between them and within her. As they walked back along the castle battlements, the kingdom spread out below them, a tapestry of green fields and dark forests. Selina suddenly stopped, her head tilting as if listening to a sound only she could hear. She walked to the edge of the parapet, her gaze fixed on a section of the massive outer wall far below. "There," she said, pointing. "The wall. It's weak." Lucien followed her gaze. "That section was rebuilt 10 years ago. It's the strongest part of the curtain wall." "No," she insisted, her eyes closed now, her senses focused. "I can feel it, a vibration, deep inside the stone, the wind. It sounds different when it passes over it. There's a flaw, a hollowness. It's not stable." She hesitated, and he saw the conflict in her face. This was knowledge she could have kept, a secret to be used for a future escape. It was a weapon. After a long moment, she met his eyes, her own gaze clear and resolute. She had made a choice. She was giving him the weapon. Stunned by her conviction, Lucien summoned the master of the guard and a stonemason. They were skeptical, but the king's command was absolute. They rappelled down the wall, their hammers tapping against the stone. For an hour, they found nothing. Lucien felt a pang of disappointment, while Valerius, who had appeared to oversee the spectacle, wore a smug, triumphant sneer. Then, one of the masons called out, his voice echoing up the wall. He had found it. A section of mortar, improperly mixed with sand, had crumbled away on the inside, creating a cavity, a hidden weakness that would have buckled under the force of a siege ram. It was a flaw no scout could have ever seen. It was a flaw only she could have sensed. It was an act of loyalty so profound, so undeniable, that it shattered the last remnants of his doubt. She had chosen his side. She had chosen their side. That same evening, in a damp, torchlit chamber deep in the castle's underbelly, Lord Valerius met with a hooded figure. He was a messenger from Alpha King, the ruthless purist who ruled the northern packs. "The king is lost," Valerius whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "He keeps the half-blood with him constantly. He trains with her. He listens to her fantasies. He brought the court to a standstill this morning, tapping on a wall like a madman at her command. The hooded figure was silent for a moment. And the prophecy? He clings to it like a drowning man to a splinter of wood, Valerius sneered. He believes she is a key. I believe she is the poison that will allow us to finally cleanse this kingdom of his weakness. Alpha Kale is ready? The packs are mustered at the border, the messenger confirmed. They await your signal. They await the moment the kingdom is divided, and the Alpha King is at his weakest. Valerius smiled, a chilling, cruel expression in the flickering torchlight. Then tell your Alpha to prepare his wolves. The king's weakness will soon be his undoing, and I will be the one to deliver the final blow. The conspiracy was sealed, a pact of hatred and ambition made in the shadows, ready to tear the kingdom and the fated mates apart. The jarring, frantic clang of the alarm bell shattered the peace of the evening. It was a sound that hadn't been heard in the capital for over a decade, a brutal, brazen cry of war that sent birds scattering from the castle ramparts and servants spilling into the courtyards with panicked shouts. The attack came without warning, a savage, coordinated strike not on the capital itself, but on Black Rock Fort, the key strategic outpost that guarded the northern pass. The news came via a series of frantic signal fires, their desperate orange flames blooming one after another along the distant ridgeline, each one a testament to a failing defense. The war room was a vortex of controlled chaos. Maps were spread across a massive oak table, markers shoved about with agitated hands. Lucien stood at its head, his face a granite mask of fury, his commanders shouting over one another, their strategies dissolving into a cacophony of blame and confusion. The reports were grim. The northern purist forces, led by the notoriously brutal Alpha Kyle, were not just attacking, they were systematically dismantling Blackrock's defenses with an unnatural speed and precision. They seemed to know every patrol route, every weak point, every countermaneuver before it was even executed. "They've breached the western wall," one commander yelled, his face pale. "How is that possible? It should have held for a week. Our scouts are being picked off before they can even report back," another added, slamming his fist on the table. "It's like they're ghosts." Lord Valerius stood near the fire, his expression one of grave concern that barely concealed a current of dark satisfaction. He let the chaos build, his silence more damning than any accusation. When a young captain proposed a flanking maneuver, Valerius spoke, his voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "A foolish risk. You would be sending our men into a blind trap. The enemy clearly has superior intelligence." He glanced at Lucien, a flicker of insinuation in his eyes. "One must wonder how they came by it." The poison was subtle, but it seeped into the air, planting the seed of doubt. He was making Lucien's command appear weak, compromised. "See?" he murmured to a lord standing beside him, his voice a venomous whisper meant to be overheard. "He listens to the half-breed's fantasies while our men die." In the gilded cage of the Queen's suite, Selina felt the battle not as a distant report, but as a sickening tremor in her own bones. At first, it was a low, unsettling hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the very stones of the castle. She pressed her palm to the floor, her senses reaching out, extending beyond the walls of her prison. It was a unique half-blood trait, one she had never understood. A strange sensitivity to the deep rhythms of the earth. Now, that sensitivity was a torment. She could feel the ground shaking miles away, the rhythmic, pounding tread of hundreds of marching feet, the concussive blasts of siege engines, the deep, guttural roars of wolves in battle. But there was something else, something wrong. Beneath the surface chaos, she felt a different vibration, a coordinated, subterranean movement. Tunnels. They were using tunnels, moving under the earth like termites, bypassing the fortress walls to strike from within. That's why the walls were falling so quickly, why the scouts were vanishing. They weren't being attacked from the front. They were being hollowed out from below. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The men were dying. Lucien's men. The kingdom that held her captive, the kingdom she despised, was being torn apart, and she held the key to its survival. Fear warred with a new, unfamiliar sense of responsibility. To stay silent was to let Valerius and his hidden allies win. It was to let Lucien, the man who had saved her, The man who had brought her warm bread, the man whose soul was inexplicably tied to her own, fail. She couldn't let that happen. Her survival was now intrinsically linked to his. With a cry of desperate resolve, she threw open her chamber door, shoving past the stunned royal guards. "Let me pass," she yelled, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. "The king's life is in danger." They hesitated for only a second before the urgency in her eyes compelled them to step aside. She ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone floors, her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild hope carrying her toward the chaos of the war room. She burst through the heavy doors like a storm, her hair wild, her eyes blazing. The room fell silent, every commander turning to stare at the half-blood prisoner who had dared to intrude upon their council of war. Valerius's face hardened into a mask of pure contempt. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? Seize her." "No!" Selina cried, her gaze locking on Lucien. "They're in the ground, tunnels. They're using the old mining tunnels to get inside the fortress. You're fighting shadows on the walls while the heart of the fort is being eaten away from beneath you." A wave of scornful laughter and angry muttering filled the room. "Absurd!" one general scoffed. "The woman is hysterical. She speaks nonsense to distract us further," Valerius declared, his voice booming with righteous indignation. "Guards, remove her at once. She will be flogged for this." But Lucien didn't look away from her. He saw the frantic terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw the same unshakable conviction she'd had when she'd pointed out the flaw in his castle wall. He felt the truth of her words not in his mind, but in the humming certainty of the bond that connected them. She was his key. She was his advantage. In that moment, he made a choice that would define his reign and seal their fate. He would trust the bond over the combined experience of all his commanders. He would trust times her asterisk. He slammed his gauntleted fist onto the table, the impact silencing the room in an instant. "Enough!" he roared, his voice a crack of thunder. He turned his burning silver gaze on his stunned generals. "You have given me nothing but failed strategies and panicked excuses. Your eyes and ears have failed us. She has given me an advantage." He pointed a finger at Selina, not as an accuser, but as a commander indicating his most vital asset. "We will follow her intelligence." He then turned to Valerius, his eyes cold as ice. "You will remain here and command the capital's defense. I will lead the relief force myself." He strode toward the door, grabbing a black cloak from a stand. He paused and looked back at Selina, his voice ringing with an absolute, unchallengeable command that made the very air vibrate. "She rides with me." The ride to Blackrock Fort was a frantic, desperate race against time. Lucien led a force of 500 of his elite royal guard, a river of dark steel and snarling wolves flowing through the moonlit landscape. Selina rode a swift black mare beside him, the wind whipping at her hair, her senses alive and screaming with the proximity of the battle. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, exhilarating sense of purpose. She was no longer a captive. She was a weapon. As they drew closer, she could guide them with uncanny precision, her connection to the earth giving her a map no one else could see. "Veer left!" she shouted over the thunder of hooves. "There's a patrol in the woods ahead, just beyond that ridge." Lucien relayed the command without hesitation, and they bypassed the ambush completely. A few miles later, she stiffened again. "To the east! There's a ravine. They're coming through the ravine. A dozen of them, maybe more, trying to circle behind the fort's main gate." Lucien split his force, sending a detachment to intercept them while he pushed on with the main column. They arrived at Blackrock Fort to a scene from a nightmare. The outer walls were breached and burning, and the courtyard was a maelstrom of chaotic, desperate fighting. Kael's purest forces, distinguished by their white wolf pelts, were pouring in, overwhelming the fort's exhausted defenders. Lucien didn't hesitate. With a roar that was more wolf than man, he drew his sword and plunged into the fray, his royal guard crashing into the enemy's flank like a tidal wave. In the heart of the battle, Lucien let his own wolf surge forward. His form shifted, bones cracking and reforming, his human shape melting away into that of a massive silver wolf, his eyes glowing with righteous fury. He was a whirlwind of silver death, his claws and teeth tearing through the enemy ranks, a symbol of hope and terror for his men. Selina, however, was the true eye of the storm. While Lucien was its destructive force, she was its guiding intelligence. From a vantage point on a rocky outcrop overlooking the courtyard, the chaos of the battle resolved itself into a clear, legible pattern for her. Her senses, a blend of human intuition and preternatural wolf perception, allowed her to see it all. She could feel the thudding heartbeats of hidden enemies, smell the acrid scent of their fear, and hear the whispered commands of their officers through the din of combat. She became the nerve center of the defense, shouting directions to Captain Marcus, who relayed them to the troops. "Archers, top of the eastern wall. A commander is coordinating them from there," she screamed. A volley of arrows flew, and the enemy's assault on that flank faltered. They're massing for a charge at the broken gate. Send the shield wall to reinforce it. The charge was met and broken. She was so focused on the larger battle that she almost missed the singular, immediate threat. A glint of light from the shadows of a ruined tower. An archer, hidden, taking aim not at the melee, but directly at the great silver wolf that was turning the tide of the battle. There was no time to shout a warning. Instinct took over. Selina launched herself from the outcrop, her own unnatural speed a shocking blur. She landed, rolled, and came up running, grabbing a discarded shield as she went. She reached Lucien just as the arrow was loosed, a black streak of death. She threw herself in front of him, raising the shield. The impact was a brutal, jarring shock that threw her backward, her arms screaming in protest. The arrow, thick as her thumb, was embedded deep in the wood, its tip mere inches from where her heart had been. The silver wolf froze, his head snapping around. The feral glow in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second as he saw her. On the ground, the shield with the arrow in it, held in her trembling hands. She had saved his life. A protective rage, colder and more focused than his battle fury, washed through him. He turned his head toward the tower and let out a low, guttural growl, a promise of death that sent a chill through the very stones. With the enemy command structure shattered by Selina's insights and their morale broken by the ferocity of the silver wolf, the tide turned decisively. Kale's forces broke and fled, hunted down in the forests by Lucien's vengeful warriors. Victory was theirs. As the sun began to rise, casting its pale light over the smoking, blood-soaked ruins of the fort, Lucien, now back in his human form, stood before his exhausted, battered, but victorious warriors. They stared at him with awe, and then their gazes shifted to the slender woman who stood near him, her face smudged with dirt, her arm bruised, but her eyes bright with the fire of the fight. Whispers rippled through the ranks. They had all seen it. They had heard her commands, witnessed her impossible foresight. They had seen her save the king's life. She was not just a prisoner, she was an omen, a miracle. Lucien walked over to her, his movements stiff, his body aching. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a profound sense of shock and a bone, deep certainty. He stopped in front of her, the eyes of every soldier fixed upon them. The air was thick with unspoken questions. He reached out, and for a heart-stopping moment, Selina thought he might touch her face, a gesture of intimacy that would be too much, too soon. Instead, his hand settled firmly on her shoulder. It was not the possessive grip of a captor, nor the gentle touch of a lover. It was a gesture of solidarity, of partnership. He pulled her to his side, to stand with him as he faced his men. He said nothing, but his actions spoke louder than any decree. It was a silent public declaration, written in the language of kings and warriors for all to see. Asterisk, she is with me. She is one of us. An attack on her is an attack on me. Asterisk. In the quiet dawn of their victory, surrounded by the dead and the dying, Lucien Vale had made his stand. He had chosen his queen, and in doing so, had declared war on the very world he had built. There was no going back. The return to the capital was not the triumphant procession Lucien had envisioned. Though they brought news of a victory won at Blackrock Fort, the mood within the castle was sullen and suspicious. The speed of their return, coupled with the bizarre tales of the half-blood prisoners' involvement, had given Lord Valerius the perfect soil in which to plant his final, venomous seeds. He did not wait for Lucien to settle back onto his throne. He struck while the court was still reeling, while confusion was at its peak. He made his move in the grand hall, the very heart of Lucien's power. The commanders were giving their formal reports, the banners of their clans hanging silent and heavy in the torchlight. Lucien stood before the black iron throne, Selina a silent, watchful presence a few steps behind him, a position that was neither prisoner nor queen, but something new and undefined that set every courtier's teeth on edge. Valerius strode into the center of the hall, his face a mask of righteous sorrow. "My king, my lords," he began, his voice resonating with a pained gravity that commanded immediate attention. "I stand before you with a heavy heart, for I must speak a truth that will feel like a dagger in the soul of our kingdom." He turned his gaze on Lucien, not with defiance, but with a look of profound disappointment. "We have been betrayed, not by the northern pacts, not by Alpha King, but by the rot that has infested our very own throne." A collective gasp swept through the hall. This was not mere dissent, it was open rebellion. "Our king is no longer our own," Valerius continued, his voice rising with theatrical fervor. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Selina. "He has been tainted, bewitched by this half-blood sorceress. He speaks of prophecies, but I tell you it is a dark pact he has forged, a pact that has blinded his judgment and weakened his soul." Lucien's face was stone, but a cold dread was coiling in his gut. He had underestimated Valerius's audacity, his sheer, fanatical ambition. "You speak treason, Valerius." Lucien's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "Choose your next words with care. I choose them for the survival of our people." Valerius roared back, emboldened by the murmurs of support he could hear rising from a faction of the older, more conservative lords. He held up a sealed scroll, its wax bearing the broken seal of Alpha King. "You ask for proof? I have it here. A letter, intercepted from a northern messenger. A letter from our own king to the butcher Kale." He broke the seal and began to read, his voice dripping with venom. He read of promises, of concessions, of a plan to cede the northern territories, including Blackrock Fort, in exchange for peace. He read of a pact to create a new kingdom where half-bloods would be given status. It was a masterful forgery, woven with just enough truth of Lucien's shifting perspective to sound plausible to those who wanted to believe it. "He was not fighting Kale for the fort," Valerius declared, his voice ringing with triumph. "He was staging a performance, a grand lie to convince us to accept his new world order. With his half-blood whore at his side." The accusation, so vile and so public, hung in the air for a moment, then the hall erupted. "Traitor!" someone screamed. "Abomination!" cried another. The lords who had long chafed under Lucien's iron rule, who saw his newfound tolerance as a threat to their purest ideals, saw their moment. They drew their swords, guards loyal to Valerius, positioned throughout the hall, moved to form a cordon around him, their blades glinting. The castle, in the space of a single heartbeat, had become a battlefield. Lucien's royal guard, caught by surprise, reacted instantly, forming a protective circle around him and Selina. The glorious hall, a symbol of his family's power for generations, became a slaughterhouse. The clash of steel echoed off the stone walls, the sounds of battle mingling with the screams of terrified courtiers. Tapestries depicting heroic victories were torn from the walls and trampled underfoot by men fighting with a fratricidal fury. It was a bloody, chaotic betrayal. Through the chaos, Selina saw a group of Valerius's men, their faces contorted with fanaticism, rushing not toward the main fight, but toward the alcove where the sacred scrolls of lore were kept. They carried torches, their intent clear, to burn the prophecies, to erase the history that gave Lucien's bond any legitimacy. But Alara, the ancient keeper of lore, was there, her frail body standing as a defiant shield before the archives. "You will not defile this place," she cried, her voice surprisingly strong. The soldiers shoved her aside, but she clung to them, trying to pull them back. One of them, impatient and brutal, struck her down with the hilt of his sword. She fell to the stone floor, a crumpled heap of gray robes. Selina screamed her name, a raw, anguished sound that was lost in the din. She started to run toward her, but Lucien's hand clamped down on her arm like a vice. "We can't," he grunted, parrying a wild sword swing from a lord he had known since childhood. "We're being pushed back." He was right. They were outnumbered, cornered. Valerius had planned his coup perfectly. For every loyal guard that fell, 2 more of Valerius's men seemed to take his place. As they were forced back toward the dais of the throne, Selina saw Elara stir. The old woman's eyes found hers across the maelstrom. With a final, desperate effort, Elara pushed a small, leather-bound book across the floor, away from the flames that were now beginning to lick at the scrolls. She met Selina's gaze one last time, her lips forming a single, silent word, bridge asterisk, before her eyes glazed over, and she lay still. "The passages," Lucien snarled in Selina's ear, his voice ragged. "The assassin's route. It's our only chance." He shoved her toward the queen's suite, his own great sword a blur of silver as he and Captain Marcus and the handful of remaining loyalists fought a desperate rearguard action. They scrambled through the now familiar luxurious rooms, the sounds of the fight growing closer. Lucien kicked open the panel behind the drapery, revealing the dark, musty maw of the secret tunnel. "Go," he commanded Selina. She plunged into the darkness, and he followed, Captain Marcus and the last 3 guards piling in behind him just as Valerius's men burst into the room. The escape was a nightmare of claustrophobic darkness and frantic, stumbling flight. The air in the secret passages was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and centuries of decay. They could hear the shouts of their pursuers echoing behind them, their torchlight a flickering, monstrous beast chasing them through the narrow stone guts of the castle. They ran, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their feet slipping on the slick, uneven floor. At one junction, a wrong turn led them to a dead end, a solid wall of stone. For a terrifying moment they were trapped, the sounds of their hunters growing louder. Selina, her senses screaming in the enclosed space, pressed her hands against the wall, feeling for a draft, a change in temperature. "Here," she whispered, pointing to a section that looked no different from the rest. Lucien and Marcus put their shoulders to it, and with a groan of grinding stone, a hidden door swung inward, revealing another dark passage. They scrambled through, blocking it behind them with a fallen beam, buying themselves precious minutes. They finally emerged, not into the city, but through a grate hidden in a rocky crevice in the cliffs below the castle, spilling out into the vast, untamed forest that bordered the kingdom. They were fugitives. The moon was high and cold, casting the trees in skeletal shades of silver and black. The sounds of the castle, of the battle, of their lives, were gone, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Lucien stood there, leaning against a tree, the adrenaline of the fight draining away, leaving a vast, hollow emptiness in its place. He looked back at the silhouette of his castle, a place that was no longer his home, but his tomb. He had lost everything: his throne, his kingdom, his people, his honor. He was no longer a king, he was a branded traitor, a fugitive in his own lands. The weight of it all, the sheer, crushing totality of his loss, crashed down on him, and he slid to the ground, his head in his hands, a silent, broken scream tearing through his soul. They found a small, hidden cave to shelter in, the 5 of them, the last remnants of a fallen king's reign. Captain Marcus and the other guards, their faces grim, took up positions to watch the forest, their loyalty to Lucien absolute even in exile. Inside the cave, a small, smokeless fire pushed back the chill, its flames casting flickering shadows on the damp stone walls. Stripped of his crown, his armor, and his authority, Lucien was just a man, a wolf who had lost his pack. Selina watched him, her own heart aching with a pain that was not just hers, but his, a shared agony transmitted through the raw, open channel of their bond. All the barriers between them, the titles of king and prisoner, of purest and half-blood, had been burned away in the fires of the coup. All that was left was the 2 of them, huddled together in the wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and the undeniable, elemental truth that bound their souls together. She moved to sit beside him, her shoulder brushing his. He didn't pull away. He looked at her, his silver eyes, usually so full of command and fury, were now filled with a profound, desolate emptiness. In the flickering firelight, he saw her, truly saw her for the first time, not as a half-blood, not as a prophecy, not as a key to his kingdom's future, but as Selina, the woman who had defied him, who had intrigued him, who had saved him, and for whom he had just lost everything. And in that loss, he found a strange, terrifying clarity. "I have lost everything," he whispered, his voice hoarse, the words tasting like ash. "My crown, my home, my name." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "But as long as you are with me," he said, his voice breaking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Selina's own eyes filled with tears. She saw him not as the fearsome Alpha King, the butcher of her people, but as Lucien, the man who had brought her bread when she was starving, who had killed to protect her, who had trusted her when no one else would. The man who had been broken for her. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender to the force that had drawn them together against all odds. She held up the small, leather-bound book Alara had given her, its cover worn and smooth with age. "She died so we could have this," she said, her voice thick with grief and resolve. "We can't let it be for nothing. We are not done yet." He looked from the book to her face, and in that moment, the world fell away. The forest, the coup, the war, it all vanished, leaving only the two of them, suspended in the quiet intimacy of the firelit cave. The bond between them, a current of tension and confusion before, now surged into a wave of pure, undiluted emotion, a desperate need born of loss and a fierce, defiant hope. He lowered his head, and she met him halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that was not gentle or tentative, but hungry and absolute. It was a kiss of shared grief and shared survival, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of death. All the pretense fell away, all the fear and hatred, consumed by a passion that was as elemental as the earth beneath them, and as vast as the starry sky above. He was hers, and she was his. In the heart of the wilderness, stripped of everything they had ever known, they fully and finally accepted their bond, a quiet, profound, and passionate union under the cold moon, a silent vow that they would face the dawn, and whatever came after, together. Their souls, finally, were one. The wilderness was a harsh cradle for a fledgling rebellion. For days, they survived on what the forest offered, their small band of 5, a ghost of a royal court, huddled in the cold shadows of the mountains that had once marked the edge of Lucien's vast kingdom. The leather-bound book Alara had died to save was their only map, their only hope. It was not a book of roots, but of stories. In its pages, written in Alara's spidery, precise script, were the histories of the forgotten. The clans cast out and wronged by the purist regime. First by Lucien's father, and then by Lucien himself. There was the Stonefang Pack, driven into the barren northern peaks for refusing to surrender their ancient rights. The Marshfoot clan, whose lands were seized after their alpha was falsely accused of treason. Each entry was a testament to a grievance, a potential wellspring of resentment against the usurper Valerius, and against the old ways he now championed. Guided by this grim ledger, they sought out the outcasts. Their first journey took them deep into the Great Fen, a sprawling, misty marshland that even the royal guard avoided. Here, in a hidden village built on stilts above the murky water, lived the Marshfoot clan. Their alpha, a grizzled old wolf named Fenrir with eyes like chips of flint, greeted them not with deference, but with a deep, simmering hostility. His people were thin, their pelts matted, their pride wounded but not broken. "The Butcher King comes to our swamp," Fenrir growled, his gaze fixed on Lucien with undisguised hatred. "Have you come to finish the job your father started? To take the very water we stand on?" Lucien, stripped of his crown and armor, stood before the old Alpha, not as a king demanding fealty, but as a supplicant. It was a role he had never played, and the humility sat on him like an ill-fitting cloak. "I came to ask for your help, Fenrir," Lucien said, his voice quiet but clear. "The man who sits on my throne is the true heir to my father's cruelty. Valerius will bleed this kingdom dry with his fanaticism." Fenrir laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Your throne? Your kingdom? You burned our homes, Lucien Vale. You hunted us like vermin. Why should we fight to restore a tyrant who simply lost his crown to another?" It was Selina who stepped forward, the book held in her hands. The marshfoot wolves eyed her with suspicion, their noses twitching at her mixed scent. "Because he is not the same man," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that made even Fenrir pause. She looked at the skeptical faces around her. "My blood is not a curse," she declared, her voice growing stronger. "It is proof that unity is possible. I am the future your old laws fear, and I am his fated mate." She opened the book. Elara, the keeper of lore, wrote of a new dawn. Not a return to the old ways, but the start of something better. A kingdom where no clan is cast out, where strength is found not in purity, but in unity. She looked from Fenrir to Lucien, who met her gaze with a look of profound trust. "I am the bridge," she said, echoing Elara's last word. "A bridge between what was and what could be. Help us cross it." Her words, combined with Lucien's raw, unkingly humility, began to thaw the ice of old hatreds. They spent days with the Marshfoot clan, sharing their meager food, listening to their stories, and forging not just an alliance, but an understanding. From there, they traveled to the Stonefang Peaks, and then to the Whispering Canyons, and at each stop, the story repeated. Skepticism gave way to a fragile hope. Lucien, the former oppressor, became a symbol of change, while Selina, the half-blood, became the living embodiment of the prophecy, a promise of a new era. Their army grew, a diverse and motley force of wolves from a dozen different outcast clans, their banners a patchwork of forgotten symbols, their loyalty fierce and personal, forged in the shared fire of redemption. During the long, cold nights in their makeshift camps, Selina pored over Elara's book. It was more than a history. It was a philosophical text, a meditation on the nature of their people. She began to understand the prophecy's true depth. The new dawn was not just about Lucien retaking his throne. It was about dismantling the entire purist ideology that had poisoned their world for generations. Her own nature, once a source of shame and fear, was the central metaphor. She was not half wolf, half human. She was wholly both, a living union of two worlds. The prophecy was not about her serving Lucien. It was about them leading together, her vision tempering his strength, her empathy broadening his perspective. The kingdom didn't just need a strong king, it needed a wise one, and it needed a queen who could see the world through more than one pair of eyes. "The key isn't my ability to sense things," she told Lucien one night, as they sat by a fire, the vast, starry sky of the mountains spread above them. "It's my blood. It's the fact that I exist." The final night the prophecy warns of, it's not a defeat in battle, it's the death of our people through stagnation, through the endless self-consuming hatred of purism. The new dawn is unity. It's accepting that we are all part of the same world. Lucien listened, his heart swelling with a pride and love so fierce it almost frightened him. This was his queen, not a consort, not a prize, but a leader in her own right, a visionary who saw a future he had been too blind to even imagine. Their march on the capital was a silent, ghostly affair. They did not lay siege, a tactic Valerius would be expecting, his walls manned, his archers ready. Instead, under the cloak of a moonless night, Selina led them to the hidden grate in the cliffs below the castle. Lucien's new army, an alliance of the disenfranchised, slipped into the secret tunnels, their movements masked by the sound of a rising windstorm. The infiltration was tense and suffocating, a slow, creeping advance through the cold, dark veins of the castle. Selina was their guide, her senses a living map in the oppressive darkness, navigating the labyrinthine passages with an unerring certainty. They emerged not into a prepared defense, but into the sleeping heart of the castle. The battle for the throne began with the shocking clang of their swords in the quiet corridors and erupted into the main courtyard, a whirlwind of surprise and chaos. Valerius's purest zealots, roused from their beds, were disoriented and outmaneuvered. Lucien, fighting at the head of his diverse army, was a silver blur of righteous fury, his great sword singing a song of reclamation. But the true commander of the battle was Selina. She stood on the balcony of the queen's suite, the very room that had once been her prison. Her eyes closed, her senses spread across the battlefield like a net. She was not a warrior, she was a conductor, orchestrating the complex movements of their allied forces. "Fenrir, the west flank is weak," she called down, her voice clear and carrying over the din. "Valerius is sending his reserves to the gatehouse. Cut them off." She could feel the frantic heartbeats of ambushes before they were sprung. She could sense the shifting tides of morale. She could pinpoint the locations of Valerius's commanders with terrifying accuracy. She was turning the usurper's own castle into a death trap, using her unique gifts not just to fight, but to lead. The battle culminated, as it had to, in the center of the blood-soaked courtyard. The fighting subsided as the two alphas, the king and the usurper, faced each other. Valerius was a formidable warrior, his face a mask of fanatical rage, his sword weaving a deadly arc. "You are a disease, Lucien," he screamed, lunging. "I will cleanse this kingdom of your taint." But Lucien was no longer the man Valerius had betrayed. He was not fighting for an ideology, for a crown, or for the past. He was fighting for a future. He was fighting for Selina. He moved with a fluid grace, his every parry precise, his every step measured. He was not just stronger, he was more centered, his purpose absolute. He disarmed Valerius with a move that was both brutal and elegant, sending the usurper's sword skittering across the cobblestones. Valerius fell to his knees, defeated, expecting the death blow. Lucien stood over him, his great sword raised, the morning sun glinting on its polished, bloodied steel. The entire courtyard held its breath. This was the moment of justice, the moment of vengeance. But Lucien looked from Valerius's hateful, defiant face to Selina, who watched him from the balcony, her expression calm and trusting. He lowered his sword. "No more killing," he said, his voice quiet but echoing in the sudden silence. "Our new kingdom is not built on vengeance." He turned to Captain Marcus. "He is to be exiled, stripped of his name and titles, and sent beyond the borders, never to return. Let him live with his hatred, alone, in the wilderness he created for so many others." It was a judgment more profound than death, a declaration that the cycle of blood for blood was over, the battle was won. The courtyard was silent save for the groans of the wounded. Lucien, his armor dented, his face smeared with grime and blood, walked through the carnage, his gaze fixed on the black iron throne that stood on its dais, waiting. He climbed the steps, his movements heavy with exhaustion and the weight of all that had happened. He reached the throne, the symbol of everything he had lost and now reclaimed. But he did not sit. He stood before it for a long moment, then turned his back on it. He walked back down the steps, across the courtyard, his eyes never leaving Selina. He stopped below the balcony and held up his hand. She came down, her people parting before her, and took it without hesitation. Together, they walked back to the dais. He led her up the steps, and this time, he did not stop until she was standing beside him, on the same level, before the throne. He turned to face the assembled crowd, the mixture of his loyalists, his new allies, and the defeated remnants of Valerius's forces. He held Selina's hand, raising it for all to see. "There will be a new dawn," he declared, his voice ringing with the authority of a true king. "The purest laws are abolished. All clans who swear fealty to this kingdom will be welcomed, their lands and rights restored." He then looked down at Selina, his silver eyes soft with a love and admiration that stunned the crowd into silence. "This is Selina Vale," he announced, his voice filled with a pride that resonated in every heart. "Not just my mate, your queen." He pulled her to his side, and together they stood, a king forged in fire and a queen born of two worlds, facing their court, their people, and their future. The battle for the throne was over, but as they looked out at the sea of faces, a mixture of hope, fear, and uncertainty, they knew the real fight. The fight to change hearts and minds had only just begun.